Today I've got Jonathan Foster with me. Jonathan, you are a father. You are at this point, you're a heretic since you've been kicked out of the Church of the Nazarene. You're a grandpa now, grandpa of like what, 7, 8 months now?
6 months as of today.
6 months as today. So you're a grandpa now, and you are an author. And more importantly, you're a dear friend of mine. The most important part of your life, being a friend of Mason Mennenga.
Exactly. And I like how you say grandpa. Is that a Minnesota thing? Like grandpa?
That's what I always said was grandpa growing up.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
And you're 30 years old now.
God, I feel like a grandpa now.
You
I
look
know.
like one.
I know. I've got the look. I've definitely
That's
got the
right.
look.
That's right.
Well, one of the books that you've written in the last few years is called "Theology of Consent: Mimetic Theory in Open and Relational Universe," and super excited to chat more specifically around like the mimetic theory of atonement. About a month ago now, you and I were hanging out at the Open and Relational Theology Conference, and we had a nice long trip from Denver all the way to the Grand Tetons and back. And so we got to chat we chatted about a million different things, but one of those things is about your interest in mimetic theory. And so we definitely chatted a little bit about this sort of newer atonement theory, which is called mimetic theory of atonement. And I was like, you know what? That sounds like something I think people who listen to my podcast would be interested in. So I was like, let's get this scheduled. And here we are now. But I introduced you, introducing a little bit of this book. Before we dive into the actual contents of the book, who is Jonathan Foster to Jonathan Foster?
What's up, Matt? It's really good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show. Yes, we did spend a few hours in the car, but it felt like years happened to be in the car with you, but it was a
Time
good
goes
time.
slow when you're hanging out with Mason.
That's right. And he's the DJ of all the music. So who is Jonathan Foster? Man, at this stage in life, I've maybe lots of people when they get in their 50s feel this way, but I just feel like I've had a very full life. It's been replete with so many events. I've been a church planting pastor most of my life, and we really enjoyed a lot of that was really fun. Been through some loss that
Mm.
has invited me to unwind and rewind my thinking, although rewinding may not be the best word. Unwinding definitely is a good word. Founded a nonprofit with my family down in Haiti 9 years ago. Authored some books, have some degrees, 3 kids. The granddaughter's awesome. Been married for 34 years. Speaking of someone who feels like it's been a long time, my poor wife. And and have been on a theological, ecclesiological, psychological journey the last few years, and it's been really super interesting.
Love it. Well, and one of the things that you missed there is that you're a former NAIA athlete.
That's right. All conference Heart of America in 1980, probably 9. Yeah.
Wow, 1989. What was that year like when Taylor Swift was born?
Well, first of all, not surprisingly, you would be the only person I've ever been on a show with who has even said the letters NAIA together. That's hilarious. You know what's funny is at the end of that year, when it was all conference, Heart of America. I don't even think I was first team, like second team or something. I remember telling my brother, this is pretty funny. Like the rest of my life, and like if it ever comes up, I can always tell people I was an all conference football player. And I I gotta be honest with you, I think this might have been the first time it's ever come up. So,
Really? I mean,
yeah.
when it's funny is like when you're 19, 20 years old, like it's probably one of the biggest identifiers in your life, right?
Yeah.
Like you're a football player. Not only are you a football player, but you're an all conference football player.
Right.
And then you get 30 more years in your life and you realize like how unimportant that was.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it was unimportant, but yeah, it was a big deal back then, and football's been a big part of my life, my whole life. It's just funny how little it ever comes up. So, and some of that's just because it was a small college, but
Yeah.
yeah. So thanks, sir. That's important. It's important for people to know that.
Well, I feel a lot of solidarity with you as another former
That's right.
NAIA football player. So
That's right. That's
love
right.
it. Well, let's talk about atonement theory. Before we talk about mimetic theory of atonement, can you talk about maybe a multitude of the theories of atonement maybe you had grown up with, or maybe there was one in particular that was kind of the most taught one? But yeah, what were the atonement theories or the atonement theory that you had grown up with?
Yeah. So really good question and super important concept. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that throughout the history of the church, so to speak, there have been a variety of different ways that we have thought about and processed and tried to understand what was happening with, the birth, life, and in particular death, and all that was taking place that week that Jesus died and the resurrection. And so sometimes we refer to this as the atonement theories. I think it's important to highlight the fact that really they're all theories because none of us really knows exactly how to define all of this. Um, but over the years, like there's been a handful of ones, there's been several of them actually. Maybe I'll just highlight real quick. Probably, I think the five most common, and we could talk more about them, but that'll all lead us to talk about Girardian
Right.
scapegoating stuff. So the five probably most common, depending on how you look at this, and if there are any atonement experts listening, they may be scandalized by how quickly I run through these. But you've got like the moral influence theory that
Mm-hmm.
kind of was happening really pretty early on. And when I
Yep.
say early on, I mean right after the death and resurrection of Jesus, which essentially says that nothing was affected necessarily in the heart of God when Jesus died, but rather that Jesus came to live and be an influence for us morally. Then you got things like the ransom theory that has also been around. Pretty much some of the church fathers from the beginning were talking about this. And the ransom theory is essentially the idea that Jesus was kind of like God tricked the devil, and Jesus paid something as a ransom. And I'm hesitating there because the something is the operative thing. Like, did God pay the devil who was ransomed to? It starts to get problematic. And shoot, I wasn't going to try to say something was problematic so quick, but ransom, it is in the Bible. There's ransom language, but it's tough to quite understand who the ransom was paid to, God or the devil, and all those are problems. Then there's a satisfaction theory, that we sometimes call it that starts to happen around this is Anselm, so like the feudal times, the days of the barons and the lords and the knights.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an emphasis on the fact that God's, like, somehow humanity is an affront to God because of their sin. And so God's sense of justice needs to be satisfied. And that only happens through the death of Jesus. Then we have a thing called penal substitutionary atonement theory, which is a awkward phrase that develops after the Reformation. It's kind of a mashup of ransom and satisfaction, and it throws in some extra substitutionary stuff that, like, we all were supposed to die for our sins, but Jesus substituted for us, and that somehow the blood shed of Jesus saves us. And it's really probably, the predominant way Americanized Christianity has looked at atonement stuff. I think it's highly problematic, but it's a really big deal, as you know, in our
Right.
culture. Then we got the Christus Victor, which has been around for a long time too. This is
Mm-hmm.
more of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has always from the beginning, they've never thought that God needed any kind of bloodshed, but rather that somehow through the death of Jesus, Jesus descends into the grave and kind of blows the thing up from the inside out and becomes this catalyst for a new way of living and returns back from the grave, not with vengeance, but with grace and forgiveness. And so those are the kind of five main ones that lead us up to basically the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there one that in particular that you had maybe grown up with? And obviously, you grew up super Church of the Nazarene, which, if anybody listening is unfamiliar with the Church of the Nazarene, it's like a very evangelical, fairly conservative denomination. And, it wouldn't be all that different than a lot of the evangelical theology than a lot of us had grown up with, other than the fact that I wasn't Calvinist.
Right. Well, what's interesting about the Nazarenes is, so they are Arminian, they are Wesleyan. Unfortunately, fast forwarding to today in the last, especially 10 years, along with all the other binary politicized, black and white that everyone's kind of forced themselves into, a lot of Nazarenes now emote and act as if they have Reformation theology, which they really don't. So it's quite surprising how that works. And it's caused a huge problem within the Church of the Nazarene, as well as other places. But I grew up, so yeah, it's funny, I never really even heard the phrase atonement theory growing up,
Right.
which it's really crazy because it's so unbelievably important.
Hmm.
But it was mostly penal substitutionary atonement. Again, even though we were in theory Wesleyan, there was a lot of that, uh, the PSA overtones that I definitely had.
Hmm. Yeah, and I totally grew up with PSA being a huge part of like your theology, and I think you're right. Where the average youth pastor isn't probably going to say like penal substitution theory of atonement, but as soon as you start learning what that is, you're like, oh, that is that not just what you're supposed to believe about
Mm,
Jesus and his death? Like you
right.
just sort of assume that that's what all Christians even believe, and then you dive into it a little bit more, and you realize, oh wait, Christians have thought about Jesus's death in lots of different ways throughout all of Christian history. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, can you talk a little bit? I know you mentioned when you were explaining each of those five theories of atonement, you mentioned, penal substitution, particularly you think is pretty problematic. Can you talk about what you think is wrong with penal substitution?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have?
1 hour, so keep it short.
Okay. Well, so first, I guess I should say, trying to be charitable, I tend to talk about these things in terms of health versus unhealthy rather than right or wrong, good or bad. I really struggle with PSA because I have some very strong opinions about it. But maybe the best way to, I think this just helps people get into the conversation and not cause others to throw up their defensive, and again, black and white binary, good and bad stuff by talking about health. And so, yeah, to me, each of those atonement theories that I mentioned has a degree of health. Now, this, of course, invites me to vet what I mean by health. Personally, I think that I have to the best uh, possible degree that I can, at least up to this point. My theories and ideas are always changing, but health for me has to do with consent, has to
Mm,
do with empowerment, has to do with someone believing in you, has to do with forgiveness being something that someone can do that costs the one giving the forgiveness uh, probably more than the one receiving it, um, which colors how I think about love. Um, love forgives, but it costs something for the lover, um, more than the beloved. It's not a sacrifice driven thing. Health is about what's good not only for one group but good for everyone.
mm,
So when I start to take that kind of health idea into PSA, I have a lot of problems. I mean, gosh, like, well, for example, I had 3 kids. When one of them messed up, I never once, the thought never occurred to me to go find the second or the third kid and beat them up to the degree that I could then now feel like I could offer forgiveness, for
right.
the one who, which is the kind of position that PSA puts us into, which I think is absurd. I think what I started to say earlier with respect to forgiveness, like PSA tells us that bloodshed had to happen. Well, first of all, that's weird. Why, why would sacrifice need to happen? That's not a loving God. Secondly, how can forgiveness be forgiveness if someone gets paid off? It's not really forgiveness then. It's something else. And it puts us in this position of thinking that God like needed to be paid. It's a really strong economic and judicial legal, like
Hmm.
it's constantly positioning things as in, oh, Jesus was the lawyer that argued us off the bench in front of the angry judge. Actually, at the end, I guess in that illustration, he wasn't even good enough to do that. He had to substitute himself for someone was still going to die,
Hmm.
or it's an economic thing like God needs to be paid off. And that doesn't feel, that's not healthy at all. And I'm sure that if there are PSA folks listening, they'll be really offended. And to be fair, a lot of times what I'm saying isn't the way it's communicated. But also, to be fair, a lot of times it is.
Is yeah.
And and even if it's not, once you start to pull at the thread of logic of what this means, I logic is not maybe the best word because I want to talk about love at some point, and love itself is sometimes illogical. But once you start to pull at the thread, you realize all these implications. And for me, it just got to be untenable. It
Hmm.
just was like, this is not a healthy way to process. It promotes hierarchy and domination and top-down thinking. It's not good for the non-adherents, but it's not even good for the adherents of people who think this. So I think it's super troubling.
Hmm. Well, and certainly there are problems even if you kind of take a more Wesleyan
Mhm.
understanding of penal substitution, where let's say the focus is more on Jesus willingly sacrificing himself for the sake of humanity.
Mhm.
But if you, so I think there's problems with that. But I do think that may be slightly better than the more Calvinist understanding of it, where it's God is actually demanding or God is ordaining Jesus to be born into the world just so that 33 years later he can be killed for the sake of humanity. And if that's like the approach you take, one of the ideas that I've had that I'm like, I find this a little bit ironic, but I'm like, if the whole point of Jesus was just simply 33 years into his life to be killed, like if that was God's plan the entire time, why didn't he just get aborted? Like why go through all the mess of the 33 years
Right.
of him eventually starting a ministry, feeding people, healing people, and all the amazing things that Jesus did in his life. Like, what's the point of any of that if literally the only thing or the only point of it was for him to die for the sake of humanity? At that point, just abort him in utero.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like that's another super problematic thing. Like none of the things he does, the way he lives and who he reaches out to in grace and the forgiveness he demonstrates and none of that really matters. It just really comes down to the death. So another way of saying that is, well, yeah, why even talk about all that? Like we got to get to what's the point of the whipping and the torture and all that stuff that PSA people like to talk about too, as if that made the sacrifice that much better or something. It's
Right.
just it's just bizarre when you really start to see it through a lens of, again, some type of health. It's not empowering, it's not helpful, and it's actually worse than helpful. I think it's been a major reason why so much of our culture has been wrapped up in punitive, retributive, sacrificial, kind of like justice, which is it's just not a healthy move.
Right. And also, again, it makes this assumption that, well, it could be implied or it could be even made explicitly that God only sees a bunch of sinners who are on, like, that God can't see the goodness of
Yeah,
humanity at all,
absolutely.
unless it's viewed through this prism of Jesus, which is interesting because, again, like we know Jesus was born 2,000 years ago. Like, what about all the thousands and millions of people who lived prior to Jesus? Were they just unable to ever be viewed as a loved, good human from the eyes of God because they were living prior to Jesus? It's one of these weird things where it completely it's a understanding of God that I just think is abhorrent.
Yeah, me too. And about the best I can say is there is a way to read the Bible that would lead you to think that when God looked at you he really doesn't like you. And so thankfully, he looks at Jesus instead. There is a way to read the Bible that would lead you to think that that's right, but I just think it's the wrong way to read it. I think it's an
Right.
unhealthy way to read it. And I think a great deal of the reason we're in the mess that we're in our world is because too many people have read it that way.
Well, enough of PSA and horrible atonement theory. Let's talk about the mimetic theory of atonement, or some people might say, like yourself, like the scapegoat theory of atonement. Can you talk about what that even is? You described a little bit about what PSA is and some of the other atonement theories. What is mimetic theory of atonement?
It's funny that you bring up scapegoating because if I scapegoat anyone, well, I'm probably good at scapegoating a lot of people, but I tend to scapegoat the PSA people. So I'm guilty of the very thing that I try to, highlight and emphasize. So yeah, mimetic theory emerges from a guy by the name of René Girard, who was a French anthropologist in the 20th century. Actually, didn't die till 2015, so relatively recent. And Girard was something of a polymath, which means that he had his fingers in a lot of different disciplines, and people are reading him and playing with his mimetic theory implications in not only anthropology but literary criticism, certainly theology, psychology, sociology. Psychology, particularly, he emerges out of the psychoanalytic field. So if listeners are aware of Freud or Hegel or Jacques Lacan, those kinds of people, Jacques Derrida, Girard kind of comes from that field. So yeah, he proposes this mimetic theory, and it's kind of this movement of the way people desire and the way we're formed and how that builds up conflict, and then the ingenious way that we deal with our conflict, which is to scapegoat. And so scapegoating it's more than just blaming. I sometimes use the word offload. It's the offloading of our psycho-spiritual problems onto the backs of others. And then when we see our problems in others, it justifies us punishing them. And so we, excommunicate them, we kick them out of the denomination. There's no shortage of ways that we scapegoat people. Throw them in the gas oven, we throw them in the volcano, we lynch them on a tree, we don't sit next to them at the lunchroom table, we write bad social media posts. It goes on and on. And scapegoating, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff we can double click on if you want to talk more about, but it can happen one-on-one, but the power of scapegoating really takes place in group settings. So politics, national geopolitical interactions, churches. I know it's hard to believe that churches would ever scapegoat, but yeah, we've figured out, basically what Girard says is that humans have figured out that there's great power in this, and that it's always built on two lies, and that's that the group is innocent and the victim, the one kicked out, is guilty. And so I'll just say this, and then you can ask more questions about it. But this is a segue then back into the work that Jesus did as a brown-skinned man who was executed on the back streets of Jerusalem in a scapegoating sponsored, religious state-sponsored act of violence a couple thousand years ago. He turns the whole thing upside down because he was clearly innocent and not guilty. And as that story unfolds, you can tell that the group, which was led by the lynchmen, or the henchmen, Caiaphas, Pilate, and Herod, those guys are clearly all guilty. So yeah, the story of Jesus kind of messes up the scapegoating mechanism.
Yeah, the way I've thought about this particular theory of atonement is that Jesus's death exposes the lie of scapegoating.
Yeah.
It reveals to everyone that this is just not the way we should live in the world.
Yeah,
Or it ought
expose is
to,
a
at least.
great word. Yeah, expose is a great word. It reveals to us what's going on, and the world's never been the same. It really hasn't. It's we have now for 2000 years had the ability to see that the one kicked out is actually not guilty. And I would argue that a lot of our growth in civilization a lot of the good growth has been because we've been aware of the victim. And that all really happened because of Jesus. I wouldn't suggest that other religions don't necessarily have their own stories about how love helped the outsider, but I don't think the world has ever been impacted by anyone more than Jesus in this respect. Like he ushers in this whole new way of thinking about the victim.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the things that I know we chatted about when we were talking about this about a month ago is one of my potential concerns around mimetic theory, and specifically this theory of atonement, is that, again, like what it does is it shows us that there's lots of different ways that we scapegoat people, both individually and then obviously systematically or systemically. And one of my concerns is that if we have, let's say, an issue with a person or a group of people, that suddenly means, oh, am I just simply scapegoating them?
Mhm.
But that's not always the case. Like there might be legitimate reasons why we have concern about a the way a person thinks about other people or the way that they treat other people. And there might be actual legitimate concerns of that, right? Like it's a legitimate concern. I'm not just simply scapegoating the KKK. I think it's actually a legitimate they're a legitimate concern for how they treat other people, right?
Right.
And so I don't think that's just simply scapegoating, but I'm curious like how maybe Girard or other Girardians would like parse that out, that nuance out, that it's not just simply that anybody that we have concerns about that we're scapegoating them, but there actually are legitimate concerns that we should have about the way that people treat others in the world.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it is a breakdown sometimes with people because some folks will just go far enough with it to then justify their own ways of pointing out what the oppressors have done. And then as they're doing that, they can become oppressive to the point where they're now the oppressors.
Mhm.
And so they can take this and it's really easy for it to start to get unhealthy again. Scapegoating is kind of like some type of self-organizing, self-mutating artificial intelligence that's constantly reorganizing itself, and it's sometimes it's hard to see. So, but your point is well taken, and a lot of people have raised this, and they should raise it. Essentially, a question could be, how do we point out? Okay, like let's say it this way. So we know scapegoating is real. I mean, I'm just saying, I think we probably know scapegoating is real.
Right.
Like the work that he did was really brilliant and seems to be revelatory of the way that humans have organized themselves. And I don't know any of us in their right mind who wouldn't disagree with that at some level. So scapegoating is a real thing. We've used it to benefit ourselves. Okay, but what does that mean when an injustice has occurred?
Mhm.
What's crazy with Girard specifically is he didn't really spend a bunch of time on that part of it. For all of his brilliance, he tended to go in a more negative, like regressive, downward spiral kind of thing. So it's been left to others to try to take mimetic theory in a more positive, generative way, generative path. And you have to wrestle with this. Like, what does it mean for me to name something? So I have a series personally of like filters I try to run stuff through when I recognize something is unhealthy. Well, by the way, this is actually a good way of framing what I've already been trying to do in this discussion, even though I've probably failed. Like I'm constantly trying to like stay away from this black and white, good, bad, moral, immoral thing, and to be aware of the fact evil is not always so easily defined, and I'm a part of the problem, as well. And so I try to talk about health versus unhealth. That's a filter that I've kind of tried to apply to my own life. It it slows me down from rushing to be like the judge of what's going on, even in these dramatic cases. I mean, you picked a really good example. KKK. Oh, yeah, that's bad. The system obviously is incredibly evil. Are those people involved in it the paragon of evil themselves individually? I would say probably not. And who knows why some of those guys have, gotten that situation. Was it bad choices? Of course. Yeah. Was it some immorality? Yes. Was it also the context they grew up in? Like, what's their socioeconomic standing? What's their cognitive ability? What's, uh, you know, are they, do they have emotional, mental health problems? I mean, it could be any number of things, and none of us would be so audacious enough to say, "Oh, I know that every single one of those people are just like evil people." So, a second filter I think I'm naming is like trying to distinguish between systematized problems and an individual. And so I try to do that a lot with PSA. Now, people in PSA or evangelicalism or, more conservative ways of thinking may not recognize that, but I'm trying not to pick on them personally as much as the system. I'm
Mhm.
fine with picking on systems. Um, what else? Things like just being aware. I'll just name one other maybe filter, and these all kind of dovetail together. Like just being aware of the power of naming the victim and how easily I can become prey to it. So I still got to name injustice, but I think a good example is when I was booted from the denomination. So, and I actually told him this in the very last meeting or a couple of the last meetings I had with them. I said, I can tell you what's happening. What's happening here is I'm pointing out your scapegoating ways. You're going to scapegoat me for pointing this out. And that's what they did. So they scapegoated me for pointing out their scapegoating ways and got rid of me, which benefits the group. The group really, because they can pull together and they can rally around this. Yeah, we did the right thing for God kind of a thing. Well, the real issue for me became after that, I recognized how much power was at my disposal in terms of I could now scapegoat them for scapegoating me for pointing out their scapegoating ways. So I always think of Nietzsche, who said, beware the monster lest you become the monster. So, yes, we got to name the injustice, but we should probably set up some filters to make us aware of how we are doing it. Is it running, are we running rampant with this like unhealthy motivation to just call out people and are we willing to admit culpability? Like I had to admit culpability within my former denomination. By the way, I got, the thing really had to do with, well, it had to do with deeper theological issues than this, but it wound up being about LGBTQ plus human beings. So one of the things I've always tried to say is I was in that system for 40 some years, so I'm culpable with it too. I'm rambling a bit, but those are 3 or 4 or 5 things that personally I just try to keep in mind as I still do the hard work of trying to name the injustice.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I guess, like, maybe, like, simply put, I think let's say
Yes,
a
we need someone to
system
simply put
yeah,
this, Mason.
a a system or an idea like white supremacy is predicated it's found like, what its foundation is built upon scapegoating.
Mhm,
Whereas something like Black liberation is predicated on the anti-scapegoating. It's
mhm,
predicated on the elimination, the abolition of scapegoating,
right,
right? And so if let's say a Black person is crying out for their freedom, for their liberation, and pointing out, hey, here are all the ways that I'm being treated unjustly. That is not them putting their own like fears and their own like psychological issues onto white supremacy. That's just them simply crying out saying, I don't want the scapegoating anymore. Whereas white supremacy is trying to do the scapegoating. It's predicated on it. What its foundation is built upon scapegoating. And so I think that's like the significant difference. And so I think for those that might just try to like look at any kind of scapegoating and think that both Black liberation and white supremacy are doing the same exact thing. They're both scapegoating. Like, it's just a really flat analysis of what is actually happening.
Yeah, I basically agree with what you're saying. I think there's room to push back and to still hold the victim, the oppressed person, hold them accountable in terms of how they are going about doing what they are doing. And I think, as much as I don't want to say this, I think, to be honest, to be fair, to be intellectually honest about it, that I have to give the victim, I have to be able to say that sometimes the victim can be unhealthy in the way that they handle their
Mm.
response to something. Now, I'm a straight white American, relatively educated, relatively affluent guy. So I check all the power boxes. So everything I say should be like met with some bit of suspicion, or I don't know if it should be, but it could be. And I'm fine with that because I recognize my kind of privileged position. But having said that, I do think it's possible for, like a queer person to then react in such an unhealthy way to what's going on that they begin to offload all of their problems back onto those who victimize them.
Right.
The Black person could do that. The Native American could do that. So we have to keep that in play. But your bigger point is absolutely also true, in that these are different systems. They're built on different things. And if you have any kind of intelligence when you interact with these folks, you recognize that. There are still individuals within these systems that, are on the spectrum of health to unhealth. But yes, the systems
Yeah.
themselves are definitely predicated on two different things.
Yeah. And I would say, yeah, I think you're right that for the victim, the oppressed, there are, I would say, more or less more healthy ways of navigating that
Yeah,
liberation and less healthy ways of
right.
navigating that liberation. Needless to say, though, what is all unhealthy, though, is the supremacy, the oppression. And
Right.
so even if I might have like disagreements around like what might be more or less healthy around the ways to navigate that liberation, at the end of the day, the biggest problem is the supremacy. It is the oppression. And so I think it's important to have those kind of conversations of like trying
Mhm,
to parse out like what are
mhm.
the best ways to go about this. And also, at the end of the
Right.
day, as long as we have this commitment towards freedom, towards liberation, then that's what matters the most.
Yeah, and we really need people in all spectrums to be able to name the injustice without having their identity be completely 100% formed by the naming of the injustice. Like, you're around certain people, and to be fair, people maybe have thought of this of myself, but yeah, it's an art. There's science and an art to it. There's an art form to being able to call something out without attracting so much attention to it that then you're now benefiting from it. And I'm hesitating because I also want victims to benefit too. So it's tricky. It's tricky. What I thought of when we were talking was, uh, the Hebrew story. The Hebrew story was they were slaves. They were the victims. They were oppressed.
Mm,
God saves them. And then in a few, few years later, a few chapters later, what are they doing? They're building a temple to this God who saved them from slavery, but they're using slaves to build the temple
mhm.
to honor the God. So I think that is a human condition that all of us would be really well served to pay attention to. And at the same time, in our particular day and age, figure out how we can stand up for victims.
Mhm.
It's challenging for sure.
Mhm. Mhm. Let's get back to kind of the theology around mimetic theory. Out of all the better alternatives of theories of atonement, I do think mimetic might be one of the best ones. One issue that I do have with it is it's still framing it as a theory of atonement. And I think like atonement, by its definition, is requiring a death to reconcile one's relationship with
Yeah.
God. And I think that idea in and of itself is the problem. And so I think mimetic theory is great. This, understanding this analysis around scapegoating. But then to sort of flip it to be back toward, to call it a theory of atonement then seems a little interesting, because then it's kind of like Jesus's death exposes the lie of scapegoating, and that somehow reconciles our relationship with God. I'm curious, kind of how you think through mimetic theory as an atonement theory, or do you think of it as, like, an anti-atonement theory? But I'm kinda curious, like, the fact that it's still framed as an atonement theory, even though, it seems to be, like, wanting to be an anti-atonement theory, or
Yeah, I
it
think you
it seems to, like, wanna reject atonement theory even.
yeah, I think I agree with where you're getting at there. So Girard himself, I don't think I don't think he really writes or talks much about atonement specifically. So in essence, scapegoating, mimetic theory is not an atonement thing. It's an anthropological thing. It's like, here's how humans have ordered our world. We've ordered it around violence. Our religion has been a way to deal with our violence. And with the way we deal with it is we scapegoat. Um, it, of course, colors all the stuff that happens around the death of Jesus, but Girard's not doing it to come up with an alternative atonement theory. And so if you hear people saying, oh, I have a scapegoating atonement theory, that's probably extra Girardian, and it may or may not be completely resonant with some of where he's going. I think so. I agree with kind of what you're saying there at the end. I think at some level, whenever I have these conversations, I always want to take a moment to say, for me personally, um, I think it's healthy to think in terms of whatever else happened a couple of thousand years ago. There was this minority person who was executed by the powers, and it was the state, religious, economic sponsored powers that killed this innocent person. It's a murder, and at some level, like, maybe that's all that it is. Like, there's your there's your atonement right there. I mean,
Mm.
what does that say about us, and what does that say about, well, I'm jumping already and doing the work maybe for some people, but I think it says more about us than it does about God. And so I think that's what Girard does.
Mm.
He's unpacking who we are. We process things through violence. So now that I have that awareness, and that I have I generally agree with that. I look at these aforementioned atonement theories and others, and I'm like, okay, what does these things say about me? What do they say about God? And I'm probably like you. I don't know if you said this specifically, but I was reading between the lines. I don't use the word atonement really. It's in our day and age, in our context, it's taken on too much of an economic, transactional
Mhm.
kind of a feel. And I don't think that's healthy. I only think of it in terms of at one meant. So I suspect that the birth, life, and teachings and ministry, but especially the death and resurrection of Jesus, was a move of at one meant. And it can be seen in a lot of different ways. So Jesus, first of all, is at one with the sinner. In some ways, that's probably what got him killed. He became a friend of sinners. And so he's at one with them. In another way is to think of it in terms of the powers are always at one with each other. Sooner or later, the economic, military, nationalistic, religious, educational, all the systems sooner or later are going to be at one. And they will pursue the power of unity minus one. So it's unanimity. So there's at one there. There's also a way to see it that, oh, this is me being at one with that system. I am culpable in that system.
Mm.
Have I done this crap? Yes, I have. And have I benefited from this? I have. So I have to admit my culpability at the one minute. It's this is an important one. It's God being at one with Jesus. So another piece of PSA is that God had to be separate from Jesus, like that God turned his back
Mm.
and was just what, I don't know, wringing his hands, hoping that the death of Jesus would be that perfect sacrifice. I don't think that's biblical. What's Paul say? That God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting our sins against us. So I think it's God very much at one with Jesus, which then opens up all these implications about what does it mean that God would experience death. And I'll just mention one more at one thing is when Jesus returns, I mean, however the story happens, literally or whatever, it's a non-negotiable that when Jesus shows back up, he's not doing so in a vengeful way.
Mm,
He's grace and mercy. And so at one means that I I want to be at one with that kind of move. Even though Jesus like is the most innocent person potentially ever and gets murdered and has the right to stand up and to name the injustice, he does so in a forgiving, gracious way. There's a few others that I've worked through, but at one minute then becomes a really important thing for me. I don't even remember what your original question is, other than I want to say Girard doesn't really have an atonement theory. It's really more about a theory of violence and about how humans have organized the world. And I just think it would be a more substantive, meaningful approach to not project all of that crap onto God and to say that God is maybe the divine is non-violent. I think that'd
right.
be good news.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where like the some of the people that do take Girard's theory and do kind of frame it as a atonement theory. Again, part of my hesitation around that is more so that I have a suspicion or concern around atonement theory in general, not just
Mhm.
penal substitution, but atonement
Me
theory
too.
in general. Part of that reason is if we look at the execution of Jesus, what it ultimately is, and how it then gets translated as an atonement, is here we have a poor brown man who is executed by the state publicly.
Right.
And for thousands of years, many Christians, almost most, probably almost all, have thought that story, the execution of a poor brown man publicly by the state, by the most powerful empire of the time, reconciled our relationship with God. It was ultimately a good thing. In fact, for a lot of
Right.
Christians, it was the best thing that has ever happened in history was the
Right.
execution of a poor brown man by the most powerful empire in the world. And we see that story not just happen once 2,000 years ago, but we see that story happen so many times, almost every single day in
Mhm.
America, the most
Mhm.
powerful empire in the world today.
Mm.
I live a couple miles from where George Floyd was murdered.
Yep.
And I still remember that day looking and seeing what happened and realizing, oh my God, we are just replaying this story over and over. And part of that is for a lot of people in the world and for 2,000 years have thought the best thing that has ever happened in the world was a poor brown man being publicly executed by the most powerful empire in the world. And I'm like, no wonder we continue to see this story repeat itself over and over and over and over again. And so that's where my hesitation around atonement theory is in general, is that we continue to replicate, we continue to repeat that story because we think it's the best thing that has ever happened in the world. And so anyway, that's like as much as I'm like all about mimetic theory, the folks that do kind of frame it as an atonement theory, I'm like, can we just like maybe move away from it as an atonement theory? I think mimetic theory is a great way to analyze the death of Jesus, but I don't think it's this constructive thing where it's Jesus reconciling humanity with God, and that it then therefore is the ultimately the best thing that's ever happened in the world. And so anyway, that's my hesitation with
I love it.
atonement theory
Yep.
and why I think atonement theory is not just penal substitution but atonement theories in general manifest in all of these ways throughout history and especially in America today in these ways where we continue to execute publicly poor brown men. And anyway, I'm just kind of curious then maybe there's like a constructive move that you'd like to say or offer of like how you could see like mimetic theory manifesting in everyday lives for folks that might be listening. I'm just curious, like again, I think atonement theories in general manifest in that way. I'm curious, like
Yeah.
how you think maybe then mimetic theory in contrast shows up in our lives.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and thank you for saying it that way. I think you're right. at some level, this is just complete absurdity that this piece of it has to be good news. It's not good news. It's terrible news. And what Girard does is shows us why we think it's good news. So in that respect, I think it's super important because it gives us some really interesting handles. And obviously the listener probably knows this, but there are a bunch of stuff that I could go deeper in than I do in the book and in other places and other Girardians have that we just won't have time to talk about. But I think Girard gives us handles as to why we've thought something this absurd could be good news. And in that respect, I'm totally in agreement with you. And I do think our world has replicated this basic same thing. I think our world, I borrow Walter Wink's phrase and I say something like, I think we operate by the myth of redemptive sacrifice. At some level, we tend to think that sacrifice is needed in order for the divine to bless us or to love us or to give us grace or forgive us. And I just don't think that's right. And part of the reason I don't think it's right is because I'm latching on to what you were saying. It's not as if we were ever disconnected from the divine in the first place. We've always been connected with the divine. I think a common denominator of all unhealthy spirituality is this teaching that says that we were separate. And so, Christians do it in a way where then we slot Jesus into this thing that, like we've all seen the illustration and the cross gets laid down across the chasm, and finally we have a way back to God. And I just think that whole thing, it was probably well intended, but I think it's completely misguided and unhealthy. And so I agree with you. We've never been separated. We don't need to be reconnected in terms of love and grace and mercy. I do think there needs to be something that happens within the heart of a human to be more available to that connection. So it's not that God's more available to us, but that we, at some point and at several points all along the way of our journey, need to have our hearts be more open and exposed to this love that's always been connected to us. And so then a question becomes, what does the death of Jesus, does that help? And I think it does in some ways. I tend to be kind of a Christus Victor in that response. I think that the movement of Jesus into, now we're talking, these extra metaphysical terms that I can't really prove, but by faith, I suspect something's going on beyond just the material that you and I can sense, touch, taste, smell, see, hear, feel, and that Jesus affects something in there, but I don't exactly know what to say it. And I'm really hesitant sometimes to quantify it in a particular way. But that's probably for a whole another discussion. Your other question there was, how does mimetic theory help us? It helps us see violence plays a role. And then there's also all these other things that we didn't talk about with respect to desire and the way like marketing or advertising companies use desire against us. The advertising company won't tell us, and this is going a different direction, but they won't necessarily tell us like what kind of car we want to drive. They'll show us what kind of car our model wants to drive. And then we want to imitate the desires of our model. And that starts this conflictual spiral for Girard that leads to scapegoating. So there's all these other implications once you start to dig into it that I think are super healthy. But I basically agree with what you're saying in the terms of, if you just want to reduce it to an atonement theory, that's a problematic way to start in the first place, because I think God loves us whether or not we believe in any of the aforementioned things.
Yeah, I think at its best, mimetic theory is like an anti-atonement theory.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It really can be.
Yeah. You kind of were already touching on this a little bit, but how do you hope mimetic theory inspires and liberates people who are engaging with it?
Yeah, it has all these implications. I mean, just take the power piece and how we have tended to form our power systems around unity, which always winds up getting rid of the one, our economic system. I think there's probably some good stuff about capitalism. well, capitalism, I don't like isms, but okay, there's some good stuff about the capitalistic way we've organized our world, but there's also some terrible stuff, and it starts with the fact that the capital system was built for people who have capital. If you don't
Mhm.
have capital, you're out, and it's that much harder to get back in. So, even in an economic sense, the way scapegoating has always been at play. Obviously, politically, our entire political rhetoric is run on the engine of scapegoating. And the more the one group yells at the other, the more the other yells back. And they begin to imitate each other, especially at the edges, less so in the middle, but at the edges, what Girard claims is that it's our sameness that drives conflict more than our difference. I think that's I think that's pretty true.
Mm.
It's humbling and it's very disappointing when I'm in the middle of an argument with someone to recognize that. But there's also some power because the truth will set you free. It's just hurt. First, it'll hurt.
Mhm.
So I think there's reasons for people to dig into that. They could benefit from that. Yeah, a whole bunch of stuff around desire, why we desire, the way desires are constituted by others. This is a very relational, processy, relational thing, which is what I was really happy to discover the more I studied it. Our desires don't just happen in a vacuum. We're constituted by the interactions that we have with those around us and even those that
Mhm.
we don't get to interact with much, especially nowadays because of technology.
Mhm.
We, we're aware of what's going on across the world and in faraway places like Minnesota.
Mm.
And then we get influenced, in particular ways. I think that's been super, at times troubling, but super helpful for me. It reinforces the idea that I really want to have people around me who believe in me and who want the best for me. Because if I'm imitating the desires of others and they don't want what's best for me, I'm replicating the wrong kinds of desires. So there's a ton of implications with Girard's mimetic theory.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think as I started studying the politics of the crucifixion, I realized that I just don't know if I can take this as a event that atoned for humanity's sins. And when I found out about mimetic theory, that's when I realized, oh wait, there might be a different way to understand this death than I initially realized. And yeah, maybe it is that it exposes the lie that is scapegoating.
Yeah.
And in turn, it's sort of this anti-atonement theory. And so for me, it's been really helpful then to not only read about this one particular story that happened 2,000 years ago and understand the lie of scapegoating, but to then see how that plays out in our world today. Because you're right, obviously, scapegoating is something that we still see all the time by everywhere. And so it's something that is very much a part of the human condition. And even if it's a part of the human condition, it's a lie. And it's something that I think each and every one of us needs to examine how scapegoating shows up in our own lives. And yeah, I think it's just a really, really important way to not just think about Jesus's death, but to think of the entire world.
Hmm. Me too. And it was going on in the Hebrew scriptures before Jesus showed up too. I think a
Hmm.
great deal of the way you could categorize what some of the prophets are doing is they may not have had the language. They're doing anti-scapegoating work. And they're
Hmm.
saying things like, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Well, Jesus picked up on that. I mean, big time. That's
Hmm.
his big message. In fact, I think he quoted that verse more than any other Old Testament verse. So another way of saying this is love has always been present. Love has always been revealing uh, a way forward that is anti-scapegoating. It's hard because there's so much power in scapegoating. So love will put you at risk and it'll make you vulnerable
Hmm.
or it'll invite you to be vulnerable. Jesus seems to embody this as well as anyone I've ever, heard of. And then our invitation is to be at one with that whole movement and continue to go in that direction. I agree with you. I like all those kinds of ways of looking at it versus pinning everything down on that last breath that Jesus took. Yeah, so you can't parse it down small enough to get to a point where I'm like, that kind of doesn't really make sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Last question, Jonathan. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Well, it's just sad to know that this is your last question, but
My
listeners
final,
can,
hopefully not my final breath, but it may be my last question.
that's right. Listeners can get a hold of me. Probably the easiest way is just to go to jonathanfosteronline.com, and all my stuff is there, but they can find books on Amazon. My handle has wound up being Jonathan_Foster. So I'm pretty much on all social media and Substack, except I did get kicked off of Facebook, so you can't find me there.
Scapegoaters.
Yeah, exactly.
Love it. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for chatting more about atonement theory and specifically mimetic theory. I think it's just, again, a really helpful way of thinking about Jesus's death. It's been really important for me, and it's glad to be able to chat with somebody a little bit more about it who actually knows it quite a bit more than me. So, thanks so much.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.